We have had a pretty phenomenal year in our research into what we call persistent non-symbolic experience. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is in a minute. It's really because of COVID. You know, we had to switch directions like so many have. We were doing laboratory-based research, and you know, you can't have people come into your labs during a pandemic, right? And so our research this year took an entirely different and utterly unexpected direction. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a gist on that. Thank you very much, you know, for showing up and listening to this research presentation and all of that. I want to talk a little bit about what persistent non-symbolic experience is. I think at a popular level, its terms are very well known. Things like enlightenment, especially to this crowd, right? Enlightenment, non-duality, persistent mystical states. Maslow, who we just heard about, his plateau experience versus his peak experience. And, you know, Stan actually did one of the greatest favors to our research when he was a young scholar, and he was on a panel with Maslow. And he basically recognized that Maslow had talked about his own plateau experience, maybe for the only time on the record. And so he paid for him out of his own pocket to have that transcribed and put into a journal that has become one of the most important records for people like me who work in this area. So this is the type of thing that we research. And, you know, let's talk a little bit about what it is. Now, you're going to hear me use PNSE or ONE. The difference between those is that during our early research phase, we defined persistent non-symbolic experience as any of these things that sort of lasted more than a year. And so when we started experimenting with it and started putting people into this during experiments, we needed a different word because obviously they wouldn't have been in it for a year. And so that is ongoing non-symbolic experience. So ongoing non-symbolic experience is ongoing, but less than a year, and persistent is more than a year. It was a little bit of, you know, if we would have thought ahead a little bit, we probably could have defined that a little bit better and only had one term for it. But, you know, you know how research is, you don't know how it is until you're knee deep in the process. And this is like 15 years in or something at this point. So when you think about persistent non-symbolic experience or ongoing non-symbolic experience, what is it really? It's basically a fundamental shift inside someone from kind of the default animal state, if you will. And that default state is really one where you're, in any given moment, part of your system is really just concerned about survival. And so I often give the example of if a bird lands near your table and you toss it a little bit of bread, it pecks at the bread and then it immediately starts looking around for what might cause it harm. And then when it's convinced that it's safe, it pecks at the bread again, right? And then it looks around again. And our systems are really doing that. So this is a big change inside of people where that system, that part of that sort of core moment to moment, you know, on edge, on guard survival system changes. And somehow things just begin to feel like they're okay, fundamentally, at a fundamental level, that they're okay. And that can be very paradoxical because on the surface, you know, your spouse might come home and say, I'm divorcing you and I'm taking the kids and all the money. And, you know, you might have some emotions about that on the surface for sure. But if you look down deep, somehow at the same time, even though on the one level, it feels like your life might be falling apart, at a deeper level, it just somehow seems like there's this fundamental okayness, or things are fundamentally okay. There's a sense that you're whole, that you don't need to add anything to yourself. There's a sense of completeness that comes along with this. And so if you were a self-help junkie before, you're probably not a self-help junkie anymore. There's a quieting of the mind. There's a quieting specifically of the sort of negative voice that people often associate with who they are. They often think, I'm this voice in my head. And of course, that's not always a voice for different people. For some people, it's in images. For some people, it's more an emotional thing, but whatever else, you get the idea. Sort of that type of thing quiets down in people, which is, you know, really remarkable. You have a much more significant focus on the present moment You don't tend to dwell much on history or the past. In fact, people sometimes think that they're having memory issues because it's just like that, the memories just don't spontaneously arise like they used to, and they're not sitting around worried as much about the future. And so there's more of a sense of flow, really, of like a sense of life flow, as opposed to the traditionally defined psychological task flow where you have to be like doing something, where there has to be a goal orientation. You're out there cycling and you're in the zone, right? Or something like that. This doesn't require that type of orientation, and yet you still have really a very similar sense of flow. Okay, so over the years, we've basically started by really researching hundreds and hundreds of people at an in-depth level, over 1,000 people in some way. And that was with a little bit of neuroscience, some measures, sort of gold standard psychological measures, in-depth interviews. I mean, you name it. We tried to get at this problem from a lot of different angles. And one of the things that came from that was sort of the first cross-cultural, pan-tradition sort of classification of the internal psychological phenomena of people who experience this. And it turns out that there were different types of it. There's more than 4, but most people are in one of the 4, and most people are in 1, and then the next most number of people are in 2, and then 3, and then 4, and then so on. So by the time you get to 4, it gets very, very rare, and it's unusual to find someone that's in it. Now, I've talked about this work a lot. I just want to give you a little bit of background for anybody who's listening that isn't familiar with it up to this point. You can find a ton of resources out there. We wrote a book on this, so you can find all of that information in this book, which is basically available worldwide, and also non-symbolic.org. And also this year, we put it into the Society's journal, and it's become a very popular article. Last time I checked, it had something like 17,000 downloads or something, which is, really good. So then we went on to try to figure out who people were before and after, because up to this point, what we'd essentially done is just gone out and researched people who claimed to be in this. And we had a rigorous criteria for that. It wasn't sort of some random thing. But the day comes when you're like, okay, I want to be able to measure someone before this, during this transition, and then after this transition has occurred. And so we began a series of experiments called the Finder's Course experiments, where we came up with our own protocol, which was a 4-month-long protocol that took on average about 3 hours a day for people, about 2.5 to 3.5 hours a day. So about 3 hours on average. And that's a lot of time commitment, right? But we managed over the course of a number of years to get a bunch of people to do that. And you can sort of see the results on the screen, and they match what we found in sort of the native, if you will, or natural population around these people. And so there are more people in location 1 than, in location 2 after the program, and in location 3 than in location 4, and so on. And you can see it was very successful from an experimental standpoint. Roughly 70% of people or so wound up transitioning during that experimental phase. We've kept it running for a couple of years since 2018, just because people really didn't want it to go away. People that took it wanted their friends to take it and stuff like that. We have the last one, though, basically running right now. The last one started on February 5th. So it's kind of the end of the era for the Finder's Course experiments. We also measured people just to a ridiculous degree, frankly. We really hit them with so many different measures. This is just a small subset of them. People took hours and hours and hours of pre and post measures as part of participating in this protocol. And we got some really, really impressive data. And so if you look at this slide as an example, depression dropping 47%. For all participants, loneliness dropping 47%, you can look at the rest of it. You don't need me to read it to you. This is just, again, a small subset of the data. There are so much more than this. And so this was really, even just going through a program like this was profoundly transformational. But what we were really curious about is, okay, well, how transformational is it if you actually make it to ongoing non-symbolic experience versus not ongoing non-symbolic experience. And so here's a little look at that. And you can see on the left side, you have the people that were in 1, and I've bolded sort of their change, and I've bolded the people who didn't make it to ongoing non-symbolic experience. And so they went through the whole program, but they were part of that roughly 30% of people who didn't transition. They might have had temporary experiences. Most of these people would have had temporary experiences. And you can see there's a really big difference between the bolded column of percentage of change for 1 versus not 1. Like, so there's a substantial difference between these folks. Okay, so what we did this year is, when COVID hit and we had to shut down the laboratory research, we were doing brain stimulation research with transcranial ultrasound. It was pretty clear to me that we were going to be locked down for a long time. And so I started thinking, okay, what could we really do that we could do for the next year or so? Well, with the Finder's Course experiments, which we hadn't been, really doing much with the data on for a couple of years, right? You saw that they basically, the experimental version of those really ended in 2018. And so, we'd moved on to other research, frankly. We'd kept that program going. But, it wasn't something that we were really paying attention to. We'd been working on direct brain stimulation to try to induce this. So what we did was we went back, and one of the things about the Finder's Course protocol is that out of that 3 months, it was really only about 8 weeks of material that transitioned 60% out of those 70% of people. And so kind of in the back of our mind, we'd always had a thought, well, maybe we should go back and try to make a shorter protocol. But, it's like time moves on, your experiments move on, your research moves on, and you never get around to it, right? So then COVID hits, and, more or less we can't do what we've been working on for the last couple of years. And so we decide, let's give this a try. And so that's exactly what we did. And we put it out as a public program called 45 Days to Awakening. We got it down to 6 weeks. So it became a 6-week program at 1.5 hours a day, at which point more or less anyone can do it. And so about the same number of people that ever participated in a Finder's Course experiment over the years participated in the 45 Days experiments this year. And one of the things that was amazing to us is how close the results actually were. So I was expecting somewhere between a 50 and a 60% transition rate, and we actually wound up with a 65% transition rate. So these were from cohorts 1 and 2, which we're sort of considering the official experiment from 45 Days. And so those were done early in the year, and we've had plenty of time to clean the data and crunch the numbers and submit it for publication even, and all of that. And so these are numbers basically that are under submission right now with an APA journal. And you can see that, it's pretty close. You see a lot of the same patterns, but there are differences, right? So there do seem to be more people who went into later locations, as an example, in the Finder's Course protocol versus the 45 Days protocol. And we don't know, it's easy to speculate that perhaps that's an effect of the length of the program or something like that. But the impressive thing to us is how close these really were. And so that was a huge breakthrough for us. Take something from 4 months that takes, 3 hours a day down to something that you can do in 6 weeks that takes 1.5 hours a day. That's just a night and day difference, right? And so here are a couple of charts from the publication that's under submission. And so this actually shows you on the left, the graph from the Finder's Course, and on the right, the graph from
I'm on a Zoom conference right now.
the graph from the 45 Days.
I'd love to talk with you.
Let me mute that. The graph from the 45 Days experiment. All right. And so you're going to see that it's going to be, the original 3-month protocol on the left, the new 6-week protocol on the right for each one of these. And so if you look at this, what you can see is along the bottom are the different locations. And so it starts with with people that basically did not have even a temporary glimpse of non-symbolic experience while they were going through the program. And then from left to right, at the bottom of each one of these graphs there, it then goes to people who had a temporary experience, at least one temporary experience. They could have had many temporary experiences. They're all put in the same bucket. And then location 1, 2, 3, 4. For the publication, we stopped at location 4. We didn't go beyond that. There were so few people that it just, we didn't want to have to caveat a bunch of data for no reason and stuff like that. And so that's why the charts end at 4. So if you look at these, you see very similar trends and very similar scales from one to the other. And so you can see that what these actually represent, what marginal means refers to, is we basically took all of the well-being measures together and said, okay, if we were to just look at all the well-being measures that we collected, and you remember we collected a whole bunch of these things, and we sort of put them into one big lump sum to just give us an idea of how well-being changed, what would that look like graphically? And so that's what you're really looking at here. You're looking at sort of this combination of many different well-being measures. And so you can see that, if the blue line is the baseline, and so that's what people were measured with before a program, and the green line is the after line, and so that would be what people were measured at after the program. And you can basically see that there is a change, even if you don't have any experience with the program. There is still a shift that occurs. There's some sort of, improvement on well-being measures, right? Same with temporary non-symbolic experience, but it really sort of peaks around location 3. And that's not a surprise for any of you that know our work, because location 3 is often represented as sort of the pinnacle of human experience by people who have experienced different locations in persistent non-symbolic experience. It's often considered as like the most desirable one by people, just the one that feels the most amazing or whatever. And we really see that represented in these graphs. And so here's the next one. This is emotion. Right? So we want negative emotion to go down, which is why the graphs go down on this one. And you can see there wasn't really that much of a change across the negative emotion things for the people that were in 45 days. But there was a big shift for the people that were in the longer 4-month protocol. And so one of the things that these graphs, we think, help us to tease out is that there is a significant impact between a 6-week program and a 4-month program, and a 3-4-month program, right? It's about 4 months. And so that's not a surprise, but why does that occur? What we don't have is a clean read. We're not saying from this data set, okay, if you have transitioned into this place of persistent non-symbolic experience, you're going to be above this score on negative emotion type things, or below this score. There is no sort of cut score associated with this across either one of these programs. And in fact, what we think we actually see in these programs, which are a combination of positive psychology, things like meditation, some cognitive hacks, there are intensive programs around all of these things. We think that what we're really looking at here is between, if you look at the left and you look at the right and you look at the difference in the change in emotion for that group that is in the temporary non-symbolic experience, in the no non-symbolic experience thing, the far left group, we think we're looking at practice time in this case. And that's that's really a great finding to us. In other words, like 6 weeks of an intensive meditation and positive psychology practice didn't seem to really do much in these aggregate emotional measures, but it did a whole lot for the people that didn't have even any experience with non-symbolic experience during the program. It still had a significant impact on them pre and post. We see this again and again and again. We see it with effect sizes. If you were to look at, our Cohen's D scores and stuff like that, the effect sizes are, typically much stronger for the 4-month program than they are for the 6-week program. There really does seem to be a power that shows up for length of practice, if you will, and for the amount of time put in and stuff like that. So here's another one. This is for meaning, for measures of meaning. All right, so you get the idea. These are just sort of trends. But I think it's neat to see them side by side. I think it's neat to see them sort of graphically represented with the baseline and whatnot. Okay, so the second major breakthrough for us this year was a new protocol combination. So the protocol one, the data that you see here, that's the first 6 weeks. Then we thought to ourselves, what happens if we let them take the rest of the 4-month protocol, right? What will be the impact on that? And over time, we actually added a couple of additional methods to the rest of that 4-month protocol. We packed that into a second 45 days. So we crunched it down as well. And what we saw was between a 10 and a 15% overall increase, right? And so we were able to basically get people up to from 65% up to about 80%. And then we thought to ourselves, wow, what's different about this remaining, 20% or so of people? What can we figure out with them? And so we had our senior clinician, Sanjay Manchanda, do individual sessions with them and really try to sort of probe this question. And what he found was that those people primarily had two different blocks, two kinds of blocks. One was belief system blocks, maybe beliefs that they could never transition, or beliefs that they had absorbed from some religious or spiritual practice around this that was preventing them from getting to it. That was sort of a minority of people. What more people had was some sort of trauma, especially significant trauma early in their life. That was unresolved. And it seemed like when that trauma was moved beyond, which Sanjay was able to do for both of these categories, both beliefs and trauma, he was basically able to move people over 1 to 3 sessions, and then they would transition into fundamental well-being, into this persistent non-symbolic experience type of thing. And so that is, to us, another huge breakthrough, because it suggests we've never really been able to tackle that before. People always sort of fell off the end of the 3-month program. And it's like, well, who the heck knows what's different about those 30% of people that didn't transition? And so we were able to squeeze that margin down and then go at it. And now what we're trying to figure out is, can we address these people in groups? Because there's not a lot of clinicians that you can sit people down with that are capable of sort of sussing this out and whatnot. Sanjay has developed a specific expertise around these types of things and persistent non-symbolic experience over the years. And so the group stuff is being tested right now. I don't know how that's going to turn out. But this is, we think, really a huge advance, that there is sort of this roadmap that, most people we've taken out by the first 6 weeks, and then another chunk of people the second 6 weeks. And then, for those that sort of still haven't had that work for them, there's another option that will most likely work for them. And so breakthrough number 3 is that a lot of people that took this turned out to already be in persistent non-symbolic experience. And so one of the things that we did as a part of the experiment was kind of, figure out where people were at, right? And a lot of people came into the program that were in, especially like location 1 or location 2, and didn't know it. And so that was a really big surprise to us, because this was a course sort of publicly put out there. So it attracted a lot of the people who were into this. And, from this general spiritual marketplace, you had all of these people over the course of this year. We've had about 1,500 people use the protocol. And if you think about that, we've had at least 25%. We don't know the final number yet because we haven't scrubbed all the data, but it's at least 25%. And it's somewhere between 25 and 50%. It's a lot of people that came into this experiment that were that didn't know that they were experiencing PNSE until, they went through our procedures for determining that. And so one of the things that we also think is kind of interesting is that there may in fact be many more people that are experiencing this type of stuff than actually know that they're experiencing this type of stuff. That was another big surprise for this year. Okay, real quick. Another breakthrough for this year, that's sort of emerging as we began a new program for integrating this on the other side of transitioning to it. And so we're super excited about that. We've managed to get several hundred people together to sort of plow through this. If you know from our previous work, one of the things that we have an issue with is fundamentally kind of people, they'll transition to fundamental well-being, to this persistent non-symbolic experience stuff, and then they'll find themselves kind of out of phase with life because the rest of the world is still in sort of normal egoic consciousness, right? And they're not. And so there's a disconnect there. And we've put years of work now into helping people overcome that disconnect. And so we're excited to finally be entering the next generation phase of that with getting these people together and a whole other level of experiments with that. And so we're already seeing some good results from that. So I just wanted to mention that as another potential breakthrough. And then back on the brainstem side, we couldn't do much of this year, but one breakthrough that we experienced is that we think that it might be possible to stimulate now the vagus nerve on the neck, basically on the left side of the neck, right around in here, and have that be, have that transition people to persistent non-symbolic experience, have it deepen people in persistent non-symbolic experience, and have it at a very minimum really accelerate people's meditation progress for people that are meditators. We had a lot of people basically say things like, I feel like I'm at the end of a meditation retreat after a 15-minute stimulation session or something like that. And so that's another big emerging breakthrough for this year, is that we might not have to deal with all the complications of stimulating specific regions in the brain like we have been, which you more or less need a neuroscience, neuroscience team to do, and a lot of equipment. We have like close to $1 million of equipment to do that, and whatever else, right? And so that's another big potential breakthrough for this year. All right, that's it. That's all I have. So thank you.